Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid, and my inimitable co-host is back from a whirlwind tour of Europe, Dave Burstein. Welcome back.
Actually, we were lazy. We had 12 days and we never left Paris.
Wow.
No tour, just Paris.
Well, that's a big city. I'm sure you could get into a lot of trouble there.
Oh yeah, we got controlled in the metro, even though we had paid our fare. All kinds of things like that. Got in a big battle with an Uber cab driver who didn't want to take us to the airport, and we had to call a policeman.
Whoa.
And one of the phone companies tried to rip me off because that's what they do when they're 2 blocks away from the train station and know you can't complain.
Wow.
Because you're going to be leaving the country soon. These are normal things.
Okay.
We also had, of course, the best bread of our life and a lot of other very good things. And what's the greatest place to listen to music in New York?
I mean, the greatest city is New York City. I mean, well, my favorite place is outdoors, Dave. After outdoors, small jazz clubs.
Okay. Nothing compared to the Hôtel de Ville in Paris.
Really?
Which is where the mayor of Paris is. It's what looks like an 18th century enormous mansion, all lit up, giant screens put up next to the stage, and Fnac, the big electronics store, did 3 nights of live concerts, free, with people like Jane Birkin and the most popular entertainers from France. Most of them seemed like the usual French singers that you'd expect, making you wish they were Yves Montand and Edith Piaf.
Wow. It's been a while since I've been in France, several decades, but when I was there, I heard some of the most incredible Afro-Caribbean rhythms in the nightclubs that were just stunning, that I had not ever heard in the States before. You know, there's a huge African population, as you know, in Paris. And the African and the Caribbean influence there, I found that music incredible. I don't know if you had a chance to hear any of that while you were there.
We were supposed to go to a Minouche. That's the Django Reinhardt inspired, sometimes called gypsy jazz. But that didn't happen to work out that night. But we made it to a lot of places. Last time I was in Paris, we managed to hear Django Reinhardt's grandson.
Wow.
Playing, who was excellent proof that genetics do not always ensure a fine musician. But heck, it was a smoky jazz club in Paris.
Okay.
And yes, they do still smoke there.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Now that I was back and I have to face the heat of New York City and all the questionable things that we have to deal with here, I decided we should start the show with some good news.
Okay, let's
Is
hear
it really true that you never played Adventure and explored the Colossal Cave?
I never
You're
did.
old enough.
I probably have to ask my son to tell me all about that, but I missed it somehow.
Nah, he hasn't caught up with it. But you will want to ask, oh God, I had it a moment ago, Roberta Williams, who is perhaps the greatest woman game designer ever. She was Sierra Online and did a series of adventure games in the 70s and 80s, first on the Apple and then on everything else. In 1996, they sold Sierra Wireless, which was their game company, bought a couple of boats, and have been spent the last 30 years going around the world on their boats.
Okay.
But they couldn't do that for the last 3 years because they couldn't go anywhere. It was a pandemic or something. So she sat home and was getting bored and decided to go back to designing games. She's doing Colossal Cave Adventure in 3G with 26 artists and musicians helping her make it. They already have some samples up for you to look at. They hope to have the game out by the end of the summer, but of course, they're never going to meet the deadline. No game company ever does with something that ambitious. And it's hard for me to believe that you're old enough to have played Colossal Cave and never did, because that's what all the geeks did, starting in 1973 for the next 20 years.
Okay.
That was where they had mazes of twisted little passages, or like when you found the lantern, it may have been magic. You didn't rub it, you told it to turn on.
Okay.
There were bridges across the cavern. There was a Ming vase that you couldn't bring, that you had to first find and then figure how to bring it back. And I'm going to give it away. You had to find the pillow that you carried it in to bring it back. So if you didn't have the pillow, there was no way you could bring the Ming vase back without breaking it.
Right.
And everyone I knew in the computer world spent hours and hours and hours exploring that cave.
Mr. I never graduated past Pong in those days, Dave.
Oh, my brother had Pong. We bought that early Atari game. And he was in the Columbia dorms, and he was charging people $0.25 a game to play it.
Wow. Nice.
And they had, everybody wanted it. But adventure was a wild adventure with elves and dwarves and wizards and everything you can imagine. And they never did what you expected them to. And we all went exploring. And Roberta Williams, who built the first graphical adventures 5 and 10 years after adventure itself, is now back and ready to start showing her work.
Wow.
Time for your story.
Any previews or insight into what it's going to look like?
Just Google Roberta Williams and you'll find she's got a teaser trailer out there. Now, one of the amazing things is that Roberta Williams and her husband, who worked together on all the games and on Sierra Wireless and on the boat, are still together after 52 years.
Wow, that is amazing.
They got married at 18. And every gamer, every male gamer in the world, and all gamers were male at this point, was in love with her. Really? I don't remember whether it was true or not that she posed topless for an ad at one point. I think she did, because they needed to get some attention to the game. But she was gorgeous, she was smart, she was sexy, and she was one of the most creative game designers of all times. She now has come back, and she thought she'd just do this as a lark on the side, and they started getting into it and discovered two things. One, that nothing had really changed. Creating a great story and understanding what the user was interested in and what the user would follow and making the user come with you on your story was still the most important thing. And that hadn't changed. But were the tools different, and were the expectations different? So she thought she could do what she had done 40 years ago. And she thought it was going to be easy because she discovered if she needed a dragon, she could buy clip art for $25 with a superb dragon. If she wanted music, it was down there on the internet to offload. If she needed a whole gaming engine, well, she had her choice of several that were free to use until you started making millions of dollars from your game. I think she's using Unreal, which is also being used by an awful lot of the AR and VR people. But the expectations were so much higher. The graphics had to look great. The sound had to be in perfect sync and fit the mood. And they wound up hiring 22 kids, most of whom were young enough to be their grandchildren. They've totally worked remotely, which they had started to do in the 1980s. I mean, we did have modems back then, although they were pretty slow. What was your first modem, Steve?
You said when?
What? How fast?
Oh, I can't. I mean, probably what 100 kilobits per second. I can't remember the number. It was so low. I just remember
How about
that
110
sitting there forever.
bits per second?
How many?
You didn't have 100 kilobits, most likely. You likely didn't have anything over 56 if you were using a dial-up.
Yeah, that sounds all right.
That sounds right.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I started earlier. I was really a geek. My first modem I rented for $70 a month, which I somehow came up with, was 110 bytes, not 1,000 bytes. 110 bytes.
Not kilobytes.
Upgraded to 300. That got upgraded to 1,200. And to get beyond 1,200, you really had to have some breakthroughs. Bob Luckey was one of the most important people. He was running a division of Bell Labs, and he figured out how to get up to 28,000 bytes with what was called adopted equalization. And the other thing to know about Bob Luckey is he was a great guy. He did a engineering column for 30 years and always made jokes about how lucky he was, which was also his name. He died about 2 years ago at 76. Brilliant engineer. One of the many I've been really lucky to meet. But do you want to take a story or you want me to give you one?
Oh, well, there's one thing that kind of piqued my interest. Just one, the functionality of this application, and two, the technology. Maybe you can kind of break it down a little bit for us, but it has to do with something called parallel reality. That's what the airline is calling this technology that they're tentatively rolling out at a Detroit airport. And basically what it does is it enables passengers to come up to the screen, big screen. The technology will ID their face and will give them the status on their flight, departure time, tell them how far away from the terminal they are, how to move through the terminal to get to the gate. And the amazing thing about this, Dave, is that it can talk to up to 100 people at one time. This one screen can have 100 people looking at it and send individualized messages based on facial recognition to each of 100 people. I found that fascinating. And one of the things I said is that each pixel in the screen can send different colors of light in tens of thousands of directions. So while one person perceives one color, the person next to them can see another color. Have you ever heard of any technology like this?
It's hard to do that without glasses, but you definitely could do that. And I've seen a lot of that. It's also called synthetic reality. It needs about an 8K screen to be any good. And it's hard to make work without glasses. It definitely can do 3D without glasses. I've seen it. And it can look really great. And there's some people who think they want to do it. What you're looking at there is actually something that's done, every block of Manhattan by Alexa, if they have enough people subscribed. What's going on behind that screen is the same thing that happens with the 100 different Alexa echoes and Google voice recognition and everything else you may have sitting there, literally 100 in a big building in Manhattan, none of which do the voice recognition. They all listen to you, grab your voice, reduce its complexity, encode it, tokenize it, and send it up to these huge data centers in the cloud. And the data centers, and we're talking about $1 billion worth of data centers with 100,000 processors in each one of them, now often being water cooled, and even more extreme, that do the voice recognition just fine and can look up anything you want, including their directions in the airport.
So
Do
the
you use
reading this amount of people simultaneously, Dave, is that the same kind of operating paradigm?
It's the same thing as doing Jenny's building, which has a lot of apartments in it down on 97th Street. And 100 of them may all be connected to Apple or to Google at the same time. Because the data center in Virginia or Pennsylvania or Boston that's running it for New York, there are very few of them near New York, really is that big. Hundreds of thousands of processors in one building, all working together. And they're just getting bigger and bigger. The Chinese are coming. They're still behind Amazon and Google and Microsoft, but they're coming real fast. How the screen does what? I can see that, well, it's straightforward to have a camera that's taking 2,000 pictures a second. That's the kind of thing you see in scientific instruments all the time. So it's easy to see how you get the input of everybody. It's easy to see how you do the processing. I'm not quite sure how they're sending what picture out to whom. I'd have to look at it. But you do almost the same thing when you come through customs at JFK. I
kind of get the reading part kind of intuitively. I can see that, but the part that really blew my mind is that 100 people can look at a screen, the same screen, and see 100 different things simultaneously. That's kind of mind-blowing.
They can't.
Well, okay, maybe they can't.
There's something more complicated. It may need. You could do it with colored glasses. You could do it with everybody. You could easily get 2,000 pictures on the screen, but they'd be going by too fast for any one person to see them. So it's not clear. Well, there's certainly ways it could be done, but the processing power is there.
Okay.
And the processing power will keep growing. Samsung this week announced that they were in.
Let me just quick directionalized pixels. That's the part that was really kind of amazing to me, Dave. I get the processing simultaneously, but to directionalize the pixel on the screen, so this pixel points at you and I'm standing right next to you and a different pixel is pointing at me. That's the part that I find incredible.
You actually probably have to use 16 pixels for each. And then you could, which is what we're doing when we do massive MIMO and a wireless signal, forming a beam in a particular direction. And since you have 8,000 pixels across the screen, that's not impossible.
Okay.
But it's still very hard. Among other things, how do you get 100 people close enough to that screen to all be watching it? So I'll have to look it up and I'll have more. But
it's
please. The kinds of tricks that you can do.
I'd like to follow up on that one. Delta is the airline and the story was in the Business Insider. So maybe we can revisit that on another show.
Okay, which is not a reliable source. But it's definitely, they just have a lot of reporters and they have to crank out stuff real fast. So if they pick up a story from somewhere, they just repeat it without checking it out.
Okay. Well,
Washington Post does that sometimes these days too, and I've even
we'll delve into that in further detail on another show.
Yeah.
So what else you got?
Well, let me give you some follow-ups on that. Is this kind of processing power going to continue improving? Yes. Moore's law is not yet dead. Samsung in Korea has just gone into the first volume production of what they call 3-nanometer chips, where each feature on the chip nominally is 3 nanometers. It's an invented number. It's not actually the width of the channel, but it tells you that it's smaller than the 4 nanometer, 5 nanometer, and 7 nanometer that's been driving all the 5G phones and all the advanced chips for the last 4 years. So Moore's law is continuing. it's not bringing the prices down very much. Because what do you think it costs to build a plant like Samsung is building, and Intel is building, and TSMC is building for 3-nanometer chips?
I really have no idea. I know it's in the billions, but I don't know if it's tens of billions or hundreds of billions, but it's in the billions.
It's about 20 billion.
Okay.
And at that, no matter how productive it is, they're not making cheaper transistors. It's not driving the costs down, but it is using less power and it is going faster.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Samsung Korea. They're going to try to move that to their Austin plant in about 3 years, and TSMC is probably going to do that in Arizona in 4 or 5 years. TSMC was ahead of Samsung on the 4-nanometer Samsung, but they're all using the same equipment.
Mm-hmm.
The most important machine there is the lithography machine that draws the lines.
Okay.
And what they're all using is what's called EUV, extreme ultraviolet. Very, very narrow wavelengths. Put the dimensions of a human hair dwarfs the dimensions we're talking about now. We're almost down to atomic scale.
Almost down to what?
And atomic scale.
Atomic
Size or
scale. Wow. Okay.
That's the kind of thing they're dealing with. And some of the best engineers on Earth, I'm thinking, for example, of Henry Samueli, who was the Marconi Prize, the highest award in communications, thought we wouldn't be able to make it down below 5 or 7. Samsung is there with 3. Intel is not far behind. TSMC is probably right up with them. And the only reason we're not seeing anything like that from China is that the US has an economic blockade. And that's really going to come back and bite us. There's only one company in the world that makes the machines that can make these advanced chips, the EUV lithography machine. It's called ASML. It's a Dutch company. Everybody else who makes this kind of machine tried to get there, including in particular Nikon in Japan. And they gave up about 6 years ago because it was costing billions and they didn't quite have it working. Well, ASML, after spending I don't know how many billions, got it working about 4 years ago, sold them to Samsung, TSMC, and then Intel. And they sold one to SMIC in China. But the US government said there's no way China's going to be able to make advanced chips. Told the Dutch government to cut them off.
Wow.
Every school child in China knows about the unequal treaties that were imposed on them by the French and the British and the Germans and the Americans in the 19th century that were designed to wreck the Chinese economy, make sure they kept importing enough opium so that Britain to pay for the tea that Britain wanted to import from China and the silks. That was called the Opium War. And the story of that, I mean, who was the biggest dope dealer in world history? Queen Victoria, of course.
Wow, really?
Sent her troops to China to protect the opium traders. And that's one of the biggest blemishes in Western history. There's no way for us to talk about democracy, free trade, or anything when they sent in the gunships. And the real advantage the Europeans had at this point was not technology in general. It was just weapons were more advanced. The Industrial Revolution was just starting, and China was a more advanced economy, probably. India certainly was in the 18th century, for example, which is why Britain had to invade India, divide and rule. But those stories are supposed to be buried in the past. Today, the story broke. Bloomberg, I think, had it first, that the United States is not just cutting off the advanced EUV machines. They want ASML to stop shipping the older generation of what's called DUV machines, deep ultraviolet. Those can't get less than about 7 nanometers. The ones the Chinese are using haven't been able to get less than about 12 nanometers outside of the lab. But those equipment, China's bought about 20 of those machines. Their chip industry is growing at a rate faster than anyone else in the world. SMIC sales were up 53% last year. Chips are booming in China.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States wants to cut the Chinese economy off by the kneecaps. And it turns out there's one plausible choke point. Nobody in the world, except this one Dutch company, can make the machines you need to make the chips that go into things like 5G phones. Now, guaranteed the Chinese are going to find a way to match that. As I said, the Chinese chip makers are growing at 50% a year. They essentially have unlimited funds. Now, do you think the people in Holland, or the people in San Jose, or the people in Chicago, or the people at Samsung in Korea are smarter than the Chinese engineers in Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing?
Of course not. No, absolutely not.
Well, I guarantee you that they're going to prove they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the Washington Post 2 years ago when these stories were first breaking. And I didn't believe the United States would cut off China because that's an act of war. They did. They knocked $40 billion of phone sales away from Huawei. $40 billion from one company, because we're trying to destroy the Chinese economy. And nobody has ever suggested that your cell phone was a security risk, as opposed to some people thinking that the networks might be intercepted, mm-hmm. which is also probably nonsense, but nobody's ever suggested that. But despite that, we destroyed $40 billion worth of Huawei's cell phone business. Cut them off from chips, cut them off from Android. They now have reproduced Android pretty well. Mm-hmm. We just got from Huawei the new pedal search, which is like Google Maps and does a number of things that Google Maps doesn't. Well, the Google Maps and Apple Maps are still pretty darn good. Mm-hmm. But I think we have to take a break. Got plenty more stories for when we come back.
Absolutely. Okay, this is Community and Technology with Stu Reid and our long-lost traveler, Dave Burstein, back from Paris with us today. This is WHCR 90.3 FM. Stay tuned. We're going to take a brief musical break and be right back. Okay, we're back. It's Community and Technology with Stu Reid and Dave Burstein on WHCR 90.3 FM. And we're talking about technology and in particular the international chip market and what's going on in technology globally. And Dave, you were just offline asking about networks and why the U.S. seems to be lagging behind some other parts of the world. So what's your take?
Oh, no. It doesn't seem to be. I got the numbers. I'm looking for them now. We are far behind, for example, the Spanish. The US is about 40% of homes can get fiber. In Spain, they're at 89%.
Wow.
And they're building towards 100% in the next 3 years. Although I say 95% because governments say 100%, and by and large, they never do it. France is also far ahead of the United States in fiber. Now, the funny thing is that we happen to be ahead in 5G. So I wound up in a debate with one of Europe's top lobbyists and with some senior EU people at the webinar, where this top lobbyist from what's called ETNO, that means Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom, British Telecom, Spain's Telefónica, and so on, explaining that the Europeans were behind the United States because the regulation in Europe is slightly stricter than in the US. It's not very strict, but compared to what we have out of Washington, the conservative British government has stronger regulation than the liberal American one under Obama or Biden. And I just happened to have lunch with the guy from Ofcom, British regulator, 10 days ago in Paris. And we were comparing notes. And yeah, American liberals are behind British conservatives.
Wow.
Getting things done.
Why is that, Dave?
Yeah.
Why is that? What's up?
Well, let's see. We have a lot of billionaires who own our Supreme Court and own most of Congress. We have a lot of big companies. And let me throw a number at you. 0.1% of the telecom industry revenue goes into lobbying. In other words, trying to confuse regulators and people like you and me about what's going on. How much do you think that adds up to?
Probably more than hundreds of millions of dollars would not surprise me.
Telecom worldwide is $1 trillion. 0.1% is $1 billion. I can identify AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast each spending more than 100 million.
Wow.
When you start throwing in the Europeans and everything, there's well over $1 billion. And it's the best investment they ever made. The return on influencing regulators is much bigger than, for example, investing in fiber. So let me tell you how stupid this lobbyist is. I'm going to do a pile of things which are satires of the lobbyist says. So she made the claim that the United States is ahead in 5G, which we are, because we have less regulation. That is utter and total nonsense. We happen to have T-Mobile with mid-band spectrum 2 years before AT&T, Verizon, or anybody in Europe. And mid-band spectrum turns out to be gold for mid-band, and they started to build, and that's why we happen to be ahead. But the US is far behind the Europeans, including Latvia and Bulgaria in fiber to the home. So I'm going to put in quotes, top EU lobbyist, backed by British Telecom and Deutsche Telekom, explains that Europe is ahead of the US because of stricter regulations and urges more of same. And yes, that's satire. But I may just change the title Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom hire incompetent liars, leave themselves open to looking like total fools and making their clients look even dumber. But that's true about a whole thing. I'm 90% sure that we're doing something equally as dumb, maybe even dumber. As far as I can tell, we are off. The latest thing that came from Jim Sedgman, who does good research, to the FCC says we have 22 million homes that are unserved or underserved. Underserved means they can't get 100 down, 20 megabits up. The real number is at least 5 million less and probably 10 million less. I've been talking to Jim and I've been talking to the FCC, and I think I found out why they have it all wrong. That they're looking, every cable network in the United States, with not enough exceptions to be meaningful, can do 100/20. But some of them don't happen to be selling that because they have inadequate backhaul or something. So they have 100/20 at every home, but they filled out an FCC form that said they only have 100/10 or 100/15. Mm-hmm. And those bloody idiots in Washington are ignoring that they are not underserved. They have 100/20 in the local group. The second line is even that may be even bigger. This comes from Microsoft and at least 3 state agencies. If you have a gigabit to your home on cable or fiber, how fast is your internet in the next room?
Should be about the same. Shouldn't be moving much from one room to the next.
You're going to be using Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi has trouble going through walls.
Okay.
Well, if I have a gigabit in the room right here, the next room is probably going to have 100 megabits, and the room behind it's probably going to have 20. And in fact, the back bedroom has tested at less than 10.
That's a huge.
Admittedly, my walls, I'm in an old building, so my walls may be a little bit thicker than some people. Mm-hmm. So what are the states doing? There's $42 billion of federal money to waste. Connecting the people who can't be connected so far, or can't be connected by anything but satellite, is a good use of public funds. That'll cost about 10 or 15 billion if they don't waste money. But all the states want more money. You're the New York State Office of Broadband. You want as much money as you can get from the feds. Now, the New York State isn't doing it as far as I know, but Illinois and Washington and Microsoft have done this. They are not measuring broadband to the home for what the speed is, which you'd have to do when broadband comes into the home. They're measuring it at a phone or a computer that may be behind 3 walls.
Wow.
All of which is knocking down your speed dramatically.
Sounds like a big money grab. Sounds like a big money grab.
There isn't a telecom engineer in the world or a network engineer who doesn't know the problem with Wi-Fi losing speed on the other side of a wall. Mm-hmm. But I'm seeing 3 state governments swearing they have this enormous number of people who can't get decent speeds on their broadband because they don't happen to have good Wi-Fi, or they happen to have an old computer that can't keep up with their broadband. So I think I want to use a headline that I just saw in another context. The lying liars and the lying lies they're telling everybody about some of the lobbyists that I've been tracking and following, both in the US and in Europe. Did you see the redlining from AT&T?
No, I didn't. What's up?
AT&T just said that the FCC shouldn't do anything about redlining because AT&T is spending a lot of money, and if the FCC does nothing, then AT&T will continue delivering broadband.
Oh my goodness!
What the heck? You may recall that I pulled up a map 3 years ago about how Deutsche Telekom and Verizon were bringing 5G into some neighborhoods of New York, but not other ones,
I recall
especially the fast and fiber.
that.
Okay? It's been done. A few years earlier, I had one from Google in Kansas City who was putting fiber to 2/3 of the city. And guess which neighborhoods weren't getting it? That story was from the Kansas City paper, and I've read that to there. Well, Jessica Rosenworcel has put out a thing saying they want to stop redlining and they wanted to use these $42 billion to make sure there's no more redlining.
You said they won't?
$42 billion is.
You said they won't?
42.
That
they haven't noticed. Yeah, Jessica Rosenworcel, FCC chairman. They have a notice clear out of there, and AT&T just answered it. And I've just seen the news stories. I haven't had the stomach to read the original. But they're saying, we don't have to do anything about redlining. It's not a problem. Heck, I'm one of a dozen reporters who have been reporting AT&T redlining for a decade or more. And Verizon. And T-Mobile, at least in their initial build. Although T-Mobile is actually going to get to almost everybody. Next one. You want another story like that?
Okay.
No. Hey, give me one of yours. Yours don't have the anger in them.
Well, you know, I'm not sure that's true, but I'd like you to parse it for me. And that is a story about Starlink, which is Elon Musk's satellite internet company. And they are in a fight with the FCC and Dish Network over the 12 gigahertz spectrum, which Starlink wants to use for their satellite internet service, and Dish wants to use it for 5G. And
what
I don't know who's suing who, but break it down for us, Dave.
Okay, Starlink just proved that you can hire a respected engineering firm or a respected consultant or a respected accounting firm to say just about anything you want them to. The evidence is pretty strong that you can use some 12G under reasonable rules on the ground without seriously interfering with satellite. That's been clear for about 5 years. Starlink doesn't want the competition. Starlink wants to be able to put up cheap equipment that can't deal with minimal levels of interference.
Okay.
Even though and they want to knock competition off the air. I hear that all over the world. Ajit Pai did a lot of things I criticize him for. Actually did one of the best things any regulator's done anywhere in the world in the last 10 years. He looked at all the spectrum that was coming available around 6 gigahertz, an enormous amount of spectrum, 1,200 gigahertz that was basically doing next to nothing. And instead of giving it to the telcos so that they would have monopoly use and waste 3/4 of it, he decided to put it all out there unlicensed for Wi-Fi and whatever else we can come up with. I was arguing with the guy from Facebook. I think that putting it up for Wi-Fi at least doubles what we can do with the spectrum. He actually had a number that in the real world, you were getting 30 times more use out of Wi-Fi spectrum used for Wi-Fi as the phone companies were doing. And I have to go over his methodology, and he's looking at a slightly different problem. But there's not an engineer in the world who isn't going to looking at, well, I should say, there's not an honest engineer in the world who looking at it won't say you get a lot more capacity out of locally shared spectrum. It's the same Wi-Fi that I'm using here, 40 of my neighbors can use literally in the same building,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to just one telephone company
Right.
that wants to use it. And maybe with a few extra antennas, they might get 6 or 11 signals in the
So I
same
should probably
spectrum.
get a lot of pushback from the telcos on that.
Well, Pi just went and did it,
Mm-hmm.
ignored
Okay.
the telcos, told them to go jump,
Mm-hmm.
and earned my respect for doing that. Yes, he was right. So some conservatives believe competition is a good thing. In Europe, the telcos are going to the wall trying to prevent the same thing happening there. And they are making up lie after lie. Those lying liars. The latest, they just had the other association, the GSMA, which also has AT&T and Verizon as chief users, explained that it will destroy 5G if you don't give monopoly control to the telcos of all this new spectrum, 1200 gigahertz. Turns out that a well-designed network by the telcos, otherwise known as Verizon's network, using the unlicensed CBRS midband spectrum and starting to use the 4.9 Wi-Fi licensed spectrum, actually delivers more spectrum to the wireless carriers than if you give it all to them. Because it's designed to be reused. It's not designed to be used by Verizon in the East Coast, where it has far more subscribers than AT&T, which has more subscribers in Texas and California. Either of them gets monopoly that have massive unused capacity, either in Texas and California, or New York and New Jersey. You put it out there that anybody can use it under reasonable rules. You get many times the capacity. And if capacity is something that the regulator wants, and most people think having a better wireless connection for people is what the regulator wants, Pi is right, and the European telcos don't have a leg to stand on.
Right. Wow.
I'm really getting angry as I hear all this. So let me tell you one that's not neither here nor there, just useful technology.
Okay.
Facebook is losing billions trying to get virtual reality in the metaverse going. They're working very hard to make sure that the metaverse is under their control, or they and their friends being people like Amazon and Google, who are now working with them to standards that are going to exclude you, me, and anybody in the open source community. And they intend to do that in order for them to collect somewhere between 10 and 30% of every dollar spent on the metaverse as it takes over from the internet in many things. Don't know how many things that'll be. I don't know whether it's 3 years or 10 years from now. So that's what's going on. So nobody actually has spent more on building the metaverse than Facebook. And I got a chance to talk to one of their top spectrum guys.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that nobody expects to be able to build a headset that can run on 5G.
Really?
No, that we've had many guests talk about how 5G is needed for VR, and people like Verizon are yelling and screaming about how we need 5G for VR. But this engineer from Facebook, it was in a private discussion, but I think I'm trying to figure out what he said publicly, explained that VR needs a very high frame rate and very high speeds. The normal spec on that is 10 milliseconds of latency, at least 90, and preferably 120 frames per second. That needs speeds of 50, 100 megabits. You have no trouble getting that with 5G. The phone I'm talking to you on now, I'm pointing at it. That's the screen I'm using right now. Gets 450 megabits on Central Park West, and less than 10 megabits in my back bedroom, as I said before. But if it runs at those speeds consistently, it would be burning my hand and might explode.
Really?
Turns out that running at that kind of speed on 5G, which is a very inefficient protocol and needs an awful lot of processing power, is going to be much too hot for years to be on the phone. So this is why Facebook is pushing to get a gigabit every home. It's because you can't run the phone at a consistent 100 or 200 megabits that you want to. You can run Wi-Fi at that easily. Wi-Fi getting up to 900 megabits is easy. So the design of Facebook's VR wants to take a gigabit connection, preferably 100 or 200 megabits, if that all they can get, and run that to your computer or maybe to your phone in a quick burst, 10th of a second on, second off, 10th of a second on, second off, because otherwise it's going to overheat. And then run it to your goggles, which hopefully will not be these headsets that people hate, and hopefully will be more like your glasses, but they have even less power and have even bigger problem locally by Wi-Fi, which might be from your computer, my computer right over there, or my phone to my headset right here. So what I learned from an expert inspector working on VR is that the dream of Wi-Fi, that 5G could feed VR via the phone company, would blow out any realistic headset.
Well, Dave, all I can say, you've been saying for years that 5G was more hype than substance, and it just sounds like it's proving more and more to be the case. So
the 5G emperor has no clothes, but it's taking over. Did I bring that to the air yet? 70% of the phones being sold in the United States right now are 5G.
What percent?
Half of them are Apples, and 70%.
Wow.
Same in England, Australia, Japan, and China.
Wow.
Why is that? First of all, Apple is 50% of the phones in the US, and all the new Apples are 5G for marketing reasons. But you can buy a perfectly fine 5G phone for $200. At that price, who wants to buy a 4G phone at $150?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what it comes to.
Yeah.
And so 5G, which can use the mid-band and hence use more spectrum and get more speed, not because it's 5G, it's just because it's a newer phone and there's more spectrum bands, is what everybody is buying in China, Australia, Japan, the US, Britain, and increasingly across Europe. 5G has won, although it still does nothing important whatsoever, or almost anyone.
Yeah. Triumph
but for another 20 or 30, 20 or 50 bucks for a phone you're going to use for 4 years, you might as well get one that's not going to be obsolete in 2 years.
Triumph of marketing over technology, Dave. We're about out of time, Dave. We got to wind it up here. It's great having you back. This has been Community and Technology with the one and only Dave Burstein and Stu Reid on WHCR 90.3 FM. Stay tuned every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Community and Technology. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.